think it's really hard to kind of like define what the future is, and I try to focus more on like what the future could be for me to try to like make the world better if I can.
The future is really a place for us to dream and imagine, and we can change our future and shape it based on the present.
I think that the humanities program and my overall experience at Davidson has definitely shaped my vision of the future. And I definitely think that it's made me more open-minded to different ways that I could improve the future, because I'm really interested in like social justice work and advocacy and being exposed through the humanities programs to like philosophy, religion, and Africana. It's like all these different ways that you can approach these fields.
I'm a CIS intended major for law and ethics or law and philosophy, still switching between those two, and a minor in herb studies. And it makes me think like, where am I gonna find a job? Coming to Davidson made me open up, and it's usually something I don't do. It made me reach out to people I didn't think I would reach out to, and I know that for the future, there's a bunch of things that can come out for me, which I didn't think that could happen before.
Good morning. I'm Suzanne Churchill, Professor of English and co-chair of Inauguration Planning. Welcome to the Symposium, Envisioning Our Future, an event we might affectionately refer to as Late Morning with Doug Hicks. And because our topic this morning is the future, our host has invited 3 faculty experts on the past. Now, that choice is not actually as funny as it sounds, because past and future are interconnected concepts that mutually inform our present. And if we don't learn from the past, we cannot hope for a promising future. The 3 professors will join in conversation with 2 civic leaders who will provide insight into how to encourage people to embrace long-term and collective interests rather than short-term and individual gains when thinking about and preparing for the future. Our host, Doug Hicks, will introduce you to our guests and moderate their conversation. But before he does, I would like to thank just a few people who have contributed to this symposium and the series of events surrounding the inauguration. Adrian Vincent Wadi, my co-chair of planning and special assistant to the president, and Carla Eustich, owner of Style Perfect Events, the Inauguration Advisory Committee, Mark Such and the cast of Everybody, who graciously allowed us to use this hall in the midst of their main stage production, which you can and should catch tonight or tomorrow night at 7:30 or Sunday at 2. And Jim Nash and his tech team, along with the many other dedicated staff members from the physical plant, college union, relations, communications, student and alumni affairs. Finally, thank you for joining this conversation. We hope you'll also attend the inauguration ceremony at 2:30 in Belk Arena and the community celebration in Richardson Stadium from 4 to 8 p.m. so that you can top off this invigorating intellectual conversation with a beautiful ceremony and a collective celebration. And now, our host, Doug Hicks, the 19th president of Davidson College.
Thank you. Good morning. What a pleasure and honor it is to be with you today. It's been an exhilarating few days at Davidson College, and I'm personally grateful for your support and your welcome, not only over the last 8 months as your president, but over these recent days, the fun with our students at the campus block party, and the very impactful panel discussion we had yesterday on the commemoration and the design concept to honor enslaved persons on our campus. That was fantastic as well. And I'm really energized about today's conversation with bringing together faculty and alumni leaders who are so thoughtful about the present and so thoughtful about the future. And in higher education at Davidson College, we're in the future business. We are preparing leaders for service in society to make a difference, to be successful, to have flourishing lives. And it's actually the students who prompted us to talk about the future in the humanities curriculum this year, across our curriculum, and today. So I will, without further ado, I'd like to introduce our panelists. So right now, please welcome our panelists today on Envisioning Our Future. We had considered a Colbert-like entrance to have them run in or fly in, but we thought walking in was appropriate for today. I'll introduce them starting nearest to me, Patricio Boyer. Dr. Boyer is the E. Craig Wall Jr. Distinguished Teaching Professor in the Humanities and Director of the Humanities Program, as well as an Associate Professor in Hispanic Studies. He earned his BA, MA, and PhD at Yale University, and he specializes in colonial Latin American literary and intellectual culture, as well as comparative early American studies. This year, he has led a group of faculty and students, first-year students, through the humanities curriculum focused on the theme of the future. Mary Tabb Mack, class of '84, is the Senior Executive Vice President and Chief Executive Officer of Consumer and Small Business Banking at Wells Fargo and Company. Her division provides financial services to approximately 67 million individuals and small businesses. Mary graduated from Davidson with a BA in International Political Economy, and she's a former trustee of the college. She has been named by Fortune magazine as one of the 50 most powerful women in business for 6 consecutive years. This group obviously values power over history. Next, Hilary Green is the James B. Duke Professor of Africana Studies. Hilary earned her BA from Franklin and Marshall College, an MA from Tufts, and a PhD from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. Previously, Hilary worked as an associate professor at Alabama, where she created the Hallowed Grounds Project, a multifaceted investigation of the history of race, slavery, and memory at Alabama and in Tuscaloosa. Author of many books and articles, her current project focuses on how African Americans remembered and commemorated the American Civil War and its legacy. We should clap for her also. The Honorable Anthony Foxx, class of 1993. Anthony earned a BA in history at Davidson, where he was student body president, and his JD at NYU. He was elected to the Charlotte City Council in 2005 and became Charlotte's youngest mayor in 2009. Foxx was then appointed, and I called him Fox as a student, so I'll call you Fox now, was then appointed as the United States Secretary of Transportation in the Obama administration, serving from 2013 to 2017. As an executive at Lyft, his team developed Lyft Up, a program that targeted the most serious transportation gaps in cities across North America. Anthony is vice chair of Davidson's Board of Trustees. Welcome. And finally, Kristi Multhaup. The Vail Professor of Psychology, Kristi earned a BA from Gustavus Adolphus College and an MA and PhD from Princeton. Her main research interest is in cognitive aging, particularly the mechanisms that are responsible for memory. A prolific scholar and award-winning teacher, she created and maintains the Davidson Life Stories Project. She's currently president of APA Division III of the Society for Experimental Psychology and Cognitive Science, and the only liberal arts college professor to be part of the leadership team for women in cognitive science. Thank you for being here, Kristi. Well, thank you all for being here. This is an honor to get to speak with you, and it should be a lot of fun. I'm going to start with Kristi and Hilary, since you both work on memory, and that's a great place to start for the future. So let me start with you, Kristi. You study in cognitive psychology about memory, and why do we care about memory if we really are focused on the future and the present and into the future?
Thank you for having me. So memory is important because it underlies absolutely everything we do. So you found your way to Duke Family Performance Hall. You probably saw some faces you recognized and said hello. In fact, the language that you used is part of your memory system, which underlies absolutely everything you do. So a couple important things for you to be aware of about your memory system is it's not a videotape. So when you try to remember something, you're not doing what we do at athletic events where we go back to the videotape and do a replay. You're actually reconstructing your experiences, and that makes room for errors. Your memory is influencing your behavior now and what you're going to do in the future, regardless of whether you're conscious of it or not. It is busy influencing how you behave. And one thing that's particularly important for today's conversation is with new technology, we now can kind of watch the brain, what it's doing when we remember things and when we think about the future. And it turns out that the same parts of your brain are very busy when you're thinking about the past and the future, and there's a huge overlap between those things.
That's really cool, and I want to ask you more about that moving forward. Hilary, you study the past, you study memory, you've studied of freed African Americans, you've studied it of enslaved peoples. How do you think about memory and its importance for the present and future?
One of the things I think about memory, I usually look at the people of the marginalized of society. And those communities use remembrance as a form of resistance, but also their form of politics to remind themselves that they exist, that they mattered, that they contributed to these longer systems where people are telling them to forget their past, forget past wrongs done to the past. So I look at memory, and especially of African Americans and enslaved people, and where the nation told them to forget, their communities, their families, those porches, their backyards, their neighbors encouraged them to remember whose shoulders they stood on to push forward to fight for change. So I think about those who persisted, that we call counter memory, as a form of memory making and important to our future, because they never forgot. They just now have to reintroduce those who chose to forget them.
That's powerful, and as we think about the commemoration work here at Davidson, the work you've done to try to find pieces and fragments of data in economic records, in other kinds of correspondence, they weren't intended to be memory, they were intended as something else, but you're finding ways to reconstruct that past. Powerful stuff. How about you, Patricio? You lead our very unique, distinctive Davidson program in the humanities, and you chose with faculty colleagues the theme of the future this year. How do you think about what books or texts you read from the past to remember the past and focus on the future?
Yeah, I think, the origins of that theme just came from observing students last year. One of the things that really struck me was that there were 80 people who can carry guns and vote in this state. People in this room, right, who all shared a similar kind of affective framework for the moment, and it was intense anxiety, intense fear, and a certain amount of low-grade panic coming out of COVID. So kind of seeing that throughout the whole year, I think the faculty decided we want Humes to feel relevant, but we also want to remind them, right, that the humanities, the deep shelf of the humanities actually speaks to contemporary concerns all the time and has been speaking to those concerns for centuries. So rather than start with a corpus of text, which is, I think, the way maybe the old Humes program would have started, we started with a series of questions. And one of those questions was, what is the future? Because we realized from the get-go that what I think the future is isn't the same thing that our students thought the future was. Who is the future? People have really different answers to that, and the way that we answer that question sort of determines the kinds of texts that we read in class, and that hooks into what Hilary just said, right? The answer to who is the future shut out a whole host of folks from programs like the humanities in the past. Even when is the future was something that helped us try to think creatively about the kind of work that we would be looking at throughout the year. Using those questions as an organizing framework, we then pulled from our own expertise, which is, we have limits to what we can do, but we were really surprised to see how radically different fields kind of came together synergistically around those questions for students. Rather than sort of an imagined, forced teleology given a pre-existing set of texts, this felt so much more organically a product of the interaction between what we were doing, what we wanted to do, what students were concerned about, and where they wanted to go.
Fantastic. And as we think about where they want to go, we are looking to the future and into the job market, into public service, private service, or nonprofit work. Anthony, I want to start with you and ask you how you as a leader, you've been a political leader at the Charlotte level and at the national level, and particularly with transportation, but I think also thinking about Charlotte's future, our job as civic leaders is to try to think far into the future, and I think of transportation as infrastructure projects that might be 5 decades long. How do you get people, citizens, to think not about self-interest and short-term interest only, but long-term and about the collective good?
Thank you for the question. President Lincoln once said that public sentiment is everything. With it, nothing can fail. Without it, nothing can succeed. And I think that is very true. And the question that you're raising is one of, where does public sentiment come from? How does it get established? And how do you use the tools of communication and policymaking to shape public sentiment towards long-term objectives? And I would say that I've had successes and failures in the course of my life on this topic. When it comes to transportation, for example, we're building stuff that we hope will last, 30, 40, 50 more, or longer, in the case of fixed rail transit systems, for example. And the problem we have in a democracy, and in particular in a place like North Carolina, is that you have different splices of government that have different inputs into decision making. So, for example, in Charlotte, the city council had the ability to raise property taxes, but virtually no other way of raising revenue to pay for infrastructure. So to do it, they have to go to the state, and the state has to effectively bless the city using a different revenue-raising form to pay for infrastructure. And that necessarily involves the state buying into the plans that the local community has. So what I found to be useful is going underneath the elected officials directly to the people they represent and making a case to them. And so, for example, in 2015, I was very involved in getting the next to last transportation bill passed, the penultimate transportation bill maybe, in 2015. And what we did was we did 2 bus tours going directly into Janesville, Wisconsin, the home of Paul Ryan, who was at that time the Speaker of the House. Another one started in Ohio, where Rob Portman and Sherrod Brown were leaders, and then into Kentucky, where Mitch McConnell, And so what we were doing is we were going to highlighting projects that were in the communities where these leaders served and starting to raise the question as to, how can we get their leaders to help us get the transportation package through? And on December 4th, 2015, President Obama signed the FAST Act, which was the the transportation bill before this most recent one. So I think we have to always focus on public sentiment. Let me say one last thing about this. For students, you're entering a period of time where public sentiment is hugely disaggregated. The sources of information are disaggregated. It's not the old ABC, CBS, NBC news situation. And we have international elements that are trying to create more dissension in the ranks of Americans than has been true in the past. And they have the tools to do that because of the internet and so forth. And so discerning citizenship is at a premium. And one of the most difficult challenges I think you're going to face in your lifetime is with the trends of more and more people choosing not to go into higher education and more pressure on the sentiment against elitism. You are elite by virtue of where you are. And so your ability to communicate with people who don't consider themselves to be elite is going to be one of the real values that we bring into the next era of politics. And that's how public sentiment will be shaped in the future.
Thanks. And your point about shaping sentiment through telling narratives and showing up in certain places, I want to come back to you all who work on narratives of the past. Excuse me. Mary, how about you? How do you think about public interest in your very corporate, powerful career?
I'm in a very corporate career that started 2 weeks out of Davidson because I needed a job. And I have to say, Kristi, you'll have to psychoanalyze this for me, but sitting in the old Johnson gym next to a humanities professor is giving me flashbacks. So I think that's a memory thing, but...
Are you okay?
I just have to say, it's a little disconcerting as long as you don't ask me any questions. But it was interesting, Anthony, as you answered how much similarity there is, particularly to what you have been doing and accomplishing on our behalf and the kinds of things that I run into in my role in the corporate world, in that the constituencies, I mean, what we've got to think about, and I've been at Wells Fargo starting back to First Union, literally since I left Davidson, and for the last 7 years was parachuted in from another part of Wells Fargo into the consumer bank to get it back on the right track. And really what was at the core of that was thinking about all the constituencies, not just one. You know, we for sure are accountable to shareholders, but we're accountable to communities, and we're accountable to customers, and we're accountable to our own employees. And when we forget that, or we don't balance that and take all those voices in the right measure, in the right balance, then the environment really skews one way or another, and we had to bring that back to the center. But it started in my role in my job here, started with what was essentially a bus tour. I just happened to go everywhere American Airlines would fly. And I literally sat down with groups that were large enough to get a lot of feedback and not so large that people wouldn't be really candid, and just took in, what are your experiences? Let me tell you, there's no big reveal here, but let me tell you what I'm gonna do and give me feedback. And if I was met with blank stares, I said, okay, I'm gonna keep going, right? Unless you want to react to me, at which point I got a lot of reaction because people want to give input. People want to share their experiences. They want to shape the future, but they may not know how. They may not be naturally prone to do that. And so my responsibility has been seeking that, has been drawing it out of people who might not have had a voice in the past, but their voice matters, and in fact may be more informed than those who come in, thinking they have the answers.
So we've been thinking a lot at Davidson. I've been working hard for the last 5 years since the Commission on Race and Slavery, which Anthony chaired for the college. We're talking about commemoration now, but I'm wondering, I have a sense in this Davidson higher ed context how we talk about truthful accounting for the past, and I'll say this afternoon the importance of honesty and accountability for the future, that's part of the educational process. I wonder if there's a parallel for you. Like, how did you bring your Davidson education into a tough corporate situation and, like, say, convince your colleagues that telling the truth, that building bridges, even if a company or other companies have made mistakes, how do you think about that? What did you say?
Well, a lot of it was, you know, if I don't bring up the honor code now, then I don't know when I bring it up in the conversation.
Should we just say it all together right now?
That's right. But a lot of it really is based in sort of an ethical framework. And what does it mean to do the right thing in the right way? And how does that play out in a corporate environment? And that's not bad. You know, it's part of our sort of the underpinning of our country, but we've got to bring those kind of principles and values into that environment. And then for me, it's been about really developing empathy, listening. I do a lot of listening before I ever do anything else. That's what my bus tour was about. After the George Floyd murder, I started calls that have continued religiously every month. Open calls and now meetings with our Black and African American leaders to say, just talk to me. Just talk to me so I can learn, because I can't fully understand your experience, but I can develop empathy. Then you can help educate me, and then I can develop trust where I can try out ideas, and you'll honestly give me feedback, and you'll feel comfortable enough to say, I understand your intent's right, but you're off the mark here because you haven't lived my experience. It really is just sort of bringing the authenticity into it. It's no different. We act like corporate America is some sort of different bubble where the same rules don't apply, and they're exactly the same.
Thanks. This idea of listening and hearing local folks reminds me of the memory project that you've worked on, Kristi, with our students. Could you share a little bit about that and what you've learned by meeting colleagues across Davidson and elsewhere?
Certainly. So the Life Stories Project pairs a Davidson student with somebody in the community who is at least 50 years old, and the student interviews that partner. I know.
Careful.
I know.
Careful.
I'm there now too. I know. All right. So this the student interviews that person at least 6 times. And they take video and audio, and they scan in pictures from that person, and they build web pages that tell that person's life story. And then when it's done, we show it to the person. We make sure that they fact check everything. And then if it's okay with them, we can share it with the public. They can choose to have it available only to people with a Davidson login or to not share it at all. But regardless of what they decide, we give copies of that to their family. So we've had many former Davidson professors, staff people included. I made an effort to oversample from the west side of Davidson to make sure that the stories told on those pages are not only about the Davidson professors, and it's a rich source of who we were, who they wanted to be, and how they thought about making this place better for the people that came behind them. And I think that's one of the things that really hit me about Brenda Tapia, who I know is really important to you, is Brenda saw things clearly. She saw the flaws. She saw ways we could be better and challenged everyone in her orbit to make this a better place.
The Charlotte Observer had a question and answer with me on Monday, and they asked me for one moment that I recall from Davidson. I talked about being in the chaplain's office. It was really with Brenda. And she asked what I was going to do with this highfalutin Davidson education. And if I had thought about responsibility that comes with the education that we have. And I've thought about it a lot. I can still recall it. At least if, you say the memory may not be perfect. But that's what I recall, and it's been a guiding principle. Hilary, your recovery of memory, especially when you're working on 19th century questions, you can't go interview folks or go to videotape. How do you reconstruct this, and how do those narratives tie to the present and future?
Oh gosh, there's 2 things. So first thing is, I studied the period I studied because of family porches. And the stories told on my grandparents' porches of Pennsylvania, and the grandparents' porches of South Carolina, and those kinskeepers who wanted to make sure I knew the community's histories I was a part of. So I start with those oral traditions and the seeds of what I would look towards. But then I go into the archives. And for me, one of the things I read for people. I read for names. I just don't read for the larger amount. And when you deal with history of enslavement and the history of the 19th century, African Americans in particular appear in certain ways. Birth, death, tax records for someone's wealth, estates, and other dehumanizing things. But even on those tax receipts, there oftentimes was a name. And sometimes a gender, so unknown as a name. So I'm like, what was Unknown's life? What was Luna's life? What was Sabra's life? And how do I create a quilt like Elsa Barkley Brown tells us to do? We quilt the lives from these archival traces and try to build out a rich biography. So whatever I do, I try to, whenever I mention a person in my text, especially, for instance, a working class domestic, Black woman working in a household, I try to create a mini bio of that person. So it's not just a name that's advancing my argument. They were a human first. They were a mother. They were a grandmother. So taking those porch stories and that empathy to find the whole person who made history, regardless of where their background is, becomes my job as the historian. And to recognize there will be gaps in those records. But once I started looking for names, I can also hear them. They want to be heard. They're telling me, listen to me. Tell my story. And then how do you recirculate the porch stories, but the archival traces that come together in the field? So my work is onerous because it's not easy to do this, but I see myself in this ethics of care and listening to the past through the documents, but also the living descendants who then self-identified later on. And so for me, I will say yesterday was a great day, and I've already heard from other people who self-identified to me, telling me like, yeah, that was my ancestor who's gonna be part of that memorial. But I have the human and the paper. How do we put this together? But how do we tell this in an empathetic way that's not continuing harm of the past? What silences need to remain silences? What stories need to be told? And what is our duty to, as the stewards of the past, to help shape the future? Because we are creating future stewards of the past that we're now living.
Well, thank you, and it helps me to think of how the past informs the future by going through empathy. And if we can, you mentioned empathy too, Mary, in your work, and trying to listen to those stories and some of the same communities that Hilary's talking about or that Kristi's talking about. Let me ask you, Patricio, in Humes, which is such a signature course for us, can we teach empathy? Or how do you get at that issue?
Your PR people didn't clear that question with
I'm sorry.
Well,
I am so sorry. I hear what you're saying.
No.
And I shouldn't have asked you about empathy.
It's a fair question. It's a fair question, and it's actually something we've been talking about this week. And as somebody not eligible to participate in Kristi's project, I think I'm really well placed as a kind of bridge maybe between generations. I don't know if that would be accurate.
Are you
Kristi,
feeling excluded right now?
If this is what exclusion feels like, bring it on. Bring it on. Bring it on. No, this week we've been talking a lot about the role that a certain kind of affective filter might play in understanding or thinking about what history is. And so this is really, I think this is on the mind of everybody in Humes right now. What empathy is, right, and what kind of information it gives us is something that I think is at the heart of Humes, and is at the heart of kind of the humanities as a division writ large. I think we have a tendency to leave that at the margins, right? That there's something called reason, ratiocination, and then there's this other thing called the affective life. I'm someone who works on the early modern period, so for me that distinction feels really artificial, right? Because it's pretty recent. So, I mean, I would maybe call somebody in that front row of HEMS students, I'm looking at you, to answer what that means, right? What does it mean to think about empathy or any kind of affective filter as something that tells us something that is true, something that is honest, something that is necessary about the past, and something that is just as much a kind of idea as the things that we used to call pure reason?
Mm-hmm. I had dinner with a group of alums and trustees last night. We called it a gala. And one person came up to me and he said, "I'm so sorry I'm not going to be at the panel tomorrow," but he goes, "I would really like the panel to be asked about how the change in the understanding of the human being has changed our view of the future." And he was specific. I said, "Tell me more." He said, "Well, Kahneman and Tversky have changed our view of the rational man, the rational person, and have really brought in the emotions and affect. And we understand that our motivations are so much more than homo economicus, to use the term from my Davidson undergraduate. How do we think beyond the rational and beyond self-interest and critique those assumptions?" And there is so much in behavioral economics, behavioral psychology, as I understand it, that would help us. So I guess let me start with the leaders. You faculty are leaders too. The non-faculty leaders, how do you think about the citizens as rational and self-interested, but also the kind of people that we're talking about with stories and needs, and maybe reason won't get through to them? It's possible that some people in our political sphere are not reasonable.
Well, I think as a practitioner of politics, you have to appeal to self-interest. I think that rather than try to end-run it, what you're trying to do at your best, at my best, what I was trying to do was to appeal to a particular part of self-interest, to say that someone of another party, let's say, has an idea that another person of a different party finds reprehensible. Can you have a conversation about the reasons why? And will that conversation in some way yield some consensus between those two that can give rise to a third way, if you will, a solution that maybe neither of them would have come to on their own? And I think that's what I've tried to do. Now, the disappointing thing about that is that you're working within the constraint of self-interest. Getting back to long-term transportation needs or education or any of a number of things. Unfortunately, in our system, if you're in Congress, you have 2-year terms. If you're in the Senate, you have 6-year terms. If you're a governor, you have 4-year terms. If you're a local elected official in most places in North Carolina, you have 2-year terms. So if you have an ambition to change something that's going to take 30 years, and you have a 2-year term, you can put your helmet on and go for broke in that 2-year term. Or you can say, it's like sailing. When I went to Camp Thunderbird, shout out to Camp Thunderbird, that's where I got on a sailboat. Sometimes the wind is with you and you can go straight to your destination, but sometimes the wind isn't with you and you have to kind of zigzag your way to the end. And so I think a lot of our politics is more in the latter category than the former. So I don't try to, as a practitioner of politics, not as a private citizen, but as a practitioner, I never try to fight against self-interest. I try to, and sometimes, illuminate why someone's self-interest may be different than maybe where their starting point is. But that's probably the way I thought about it.
Thanks. How about you, Mary? And I'm also thinking that sometimes people don't know what their self-interest is in banking or in romance or in life. Tenure decisions? No. So how do you think, when you're talking to people, both in the workplace and your customers, they're motivated by things more than their rationality. Is empathy the way to think about that?
Well, there are a couple of things, and I'll sort of take it from maybe from both ends or sides of what we do. And the customer side of things, it really is, I like to say to our team a lot, our customers are not nearly as interested in what we do as we are. We like to talk about what we do, but they don't really care. No customer I mean, raise your hand, but nobody really wants a checking account or a mortgage. What you really want is the ability to buy groceries or to a home for your family, right? And we tend to talk about what's interesting to us, and the flip is what we really need to talk about and get in tune with is what you're trying to do. And some do that really well, and for some, because there's a lot of complexity behind the us part of it, there's a lot you have to know to do it well. But what we've got to do is translate that into your language. The flip side, or the other side of what we do a lot, I'm in a very highly regulated, I've been in the brokerage side, which is incredibly highly regulated, and banking is highly regulated. And that gets a lot of attention, but at the base of all of it, all we're trying to do, we, our regulators, our competitors, is take really good care of customers. And sometimes we lose the fact that in the dialogue about how we should do it, of what we're trying to do. And our interests are totally aligned. We want to do the best thing to care for customers, which then, we bank 1 in 3 Americans bank with Wells Fargo, which is an incredible responsibility to help people think about how to repair their credit so that they can take advantage of things in our society that are allowed because you have access to credit, or how to have a plan to get your first car so you can get to your first job. I mean, we really are enabling Americans around on a path of economic prosperity. And that all starts with doing it the right way. So all of our interests are aligned, but much like the political environment, you kind of forget that when you start arguing about the way you do it, and you forget the what you're trying to do.
That's powerful. For me, as I learned in economics and then ethics, this approach called the capabilities approach helped us to shift from means to ends. And we asked the question, what are we really trying to accomplish? And like money is a means to an end. What we're trying to have is having basic access to goods and services. We're trying to be able to appear in public without shame. We're trying to be in good health, to have community or have freedom to express ourselves this way or that. And it shifts the lens completely from if we ask what the ends are from what the means are.
We started a project last year called Banking Inclusion. And if you look across America, there's 7.5 million Americans who don't have access to a banking account. And half of those are Black, African American, Hispanic, and Native. And if you particularly think about the pandemic, if you didn't have access to a bank account of some type, you couldn't order and have things delivered to your door. You couldn't shelter in place and have access to anything. And so that wasn't about any one particular bank doing more. It was about enabling people to have access to what many of us take for granted. And it's a long term. It's 10 years, and we'll make progress over a period of time together, but we also can't do it as one. It's got to be a collective effort across the industry.
Thank you. Kristi, I want to come back to you and this point you made that it may be the same neural networks that are engaged with memory, thinking about the past and thinking about the future. I don't know if that ties to how people are more than rational, their emotions, their experiences inform the future, but tell us about this past and present similarity and using I'll just say again, the same neural pathways because I don't have a deeper understanding of this.
So I think this goes back to the idea of reconstruction, that when you are remembering something, you're basically imagining the past. And the mirror of that is when you think about the future and project into the future, you're imagining the future. So those are both basically time traveling. And that is somewhat how we talk about that in the literature now. So you can talk about time traveling, and then they might be talking about going to the past, but they might also be talking about projecting into the future. I think being aware that we are reconstructing things, we're not playing a videotape in our head, is something that should make us humble. And to recognize we might not have it right, we might not have the full picture of things, and that's why we kind of need each other to fill in the gaps, other perspectives. So Patricio, you're talking about different readings in Hume's than used to be there. Well, that's giving us a more complete look, a more solid look at the past, which then allows us to have a firmer foundation to look into the future. So I just think that going from the present to the past to the future, it's the same process. It's a time travel, and it's not solid. It is reconstructed. It's based on some things that we know about and our best sense of how those things fit together, but they might be wrong.
So
But your life is not a lie. Don't worry about that.
That's good to know. Thank you for affirming. That's very empathetic of you. So is it too much to say that if we practice our skills at remembering better, that we also can become better at planning for the future?
I think it would
If
be,
you don't answer this the right way, I'm going to ask Hilary.
just skip me, go right to her.
No.
No, but I think that is fair because it's a skill to be humble, to recognize that you might not have every voice. And so that gets you in the habit then of saying, who's not present here? Who's not at the table? Who needs to be at the table in order for us to move forward into the future in a much stronger, better position?
Hilary, I do want to ask you about that in your work as an historian.
Yeah, and one of the things I think about is the reconstruction. I always look at it as recovering because you have individual memory, but then you have collective and group memory. And you remember, but a long time with remembrance, there's forgetting and there's silencing, and those are active. So what stories are told and by whom? Whose stories aren't told, and for those on the side of being forgetting, how they can persist together. But with time, some communities will remember differently because of the political situations around them. But they have reinforcement from one another in solidarity. And I think that recovering that collective side and the part to remember is also remember the flip side of collective forgetting. Mm-hmm. And oftentimes I'm dealing with the groups of people and histories that have been intentionally forgotten and silenced. And I go to Michel Thureau's Silence in the Past and how the Haitian Revolution became an unforgettable event. Because what is history? Who writes that history? Who tells that history? Where is it archived? What the creation of those archives and who created those collections? Who write those textbooks and who doesn't see those textbooks? What is the big truth? But those who don't see themselves, I think of Carter G. Woodson, who created what we now know as Black History Month, and Asala. One of the most poignant things that unites me with him is he talks about sitting on his uncle's porches of the Civil War generation. They were Civil War veterans. West Virginia, he's sitting on their porch. And then he goes to Harvard. And at Harvard, his prominent white professors would tell him, that's not history. He knew that community education, and when he left, and he wrote the history he wanted. But it was that Black community back home that kept him grounded, not the people who told him. So what are those other community makers, and really thinking about the kinskeepers and using family history in there, but that act of recovery that's needed. So as a scholar, one of the things I have to do, especially in teaching, and my students are doing this now, we can't atone for the past and past issues and what was done. The archives, when they were created, we can't go back and magically fix this. Instead, what we can do is to have a commitment moving forward. And what is our ethics of care to remember the fullness of history, the people of history, the traditions of history, to build a complete narrative for those who were like Carter G. Woodson or like others, for these are more than words and names on a page. These were grandma, granddad, aunt, uncle, community. How they might add and feel like, oh, you want our history now too. Let's bring in. So it's that dialogue and collectiveness and empathy, but also recognition of With every remembrance, there is a forgetting. And the reconstruction, we talk about recovery. We are literally recovering what was forgotten in silence in order to reconstruct a more truthful past. And that work is an active engagement work, but it's also intentional and also recognizing what was done previously. And it's a future aim and collective and moving forward. In that future, I will tell the best stories I can. I will try to do as much as I can. It might not be complete, but I am intending to do that larger process of the communities I'm in who want their stories and to be honestly presented.
Thanks so much. And since we can't actually do time travel today, on this stage, I know that our time will end in a few minutes. I want to give each of you a chance to talk about your hopes for the future. One of my themes and the themes of the inauguration is hope. And I'd love to hear from you all. What gives you hope for the future? And hopefully it connects to things we've talked about so far. Who would like to start?
I guess I will.
All right.
My hope for the future is based on the students who I see every day who get me to work and to be my best self, who ask the questions that might not always be the easiest, who are willing to take the journey to work to build a more perfect, more inclusive, more just campus, and not be drowned in the past of where Davidson started in 1837 and who had access, but where we are moving together. So I really think about the generations of students who opened the doors to allow for the diversity that we have today, and how are we using that generation to help inform us going forward. And we're honoring all the past. But for me, my students give me hope because I know I'm not alone. And I know I'm around people who want to do this and build the Davidson that we want to have. And that hope is to use our past and learn the lessons of our past to build a more honest future.
Thanks, Hilary. You good?
And I would take your Davidson forward. I was with a colleague that some of you all know well, Keith Cockrell, who is also a Davidson parent and very proud of it. I was with him last week and I asked him about his daughter, who's in her second year of law school. I said, well, where do you think she'll end up? And he said, well, you know, she's my world changer. And so she'll probably stay in DC, which seems close to the heartbeat of changing the world. And it actually was really well timed when I thought about this conversation, because whether Davidson attracts world changers and then nurtures that in them, or creates world changers, I don't know whether it's causal or not, but it sure is evident in what happens once they leave the campus a better place. And so what I'm hopeful for, particularly here, is that Davidson does create world changers and continues to evolve as to what the needs are. We're not the school we were, and we're not the school we will be, but there's an evolution that is focused on people who leave here wanting to make the world a better place. And it sounds very trite until you go out there and try to use it to actually do that.
Thanks, Mary. Kristi?
I would echo what's been said here, and I would also name in the hope of, it's not just the current students, it's the past students, it's the alumni, and one of the things that gives me hope is our network keeps growing every year, and how I see our alumni reaching out and helping our current students and helping them get to where they want to go, and particularly for the students who were here during COVID, I think they lost a number of traditions because we all had to be remote. And I think that our alums helping our current students understand what some of the traditions were will help reestablish them. But the fact that the Davidson Network grows every year gives me hope.
Fantastic. Thank you. How about you, Patricio?
I guess maybe building on what Hilary said. Students were going to be my answer too. But building on that, it wasn't actually, I mean, I'm probably more famous for being like a nugget of irony wrapped in the loving embrace of sarcasm. So it's really hard, I think, for students.
Go for it.
To hear this. This is almost, I feel almost maudlin. I'm not terribly sentimental, but I do think it's not necessarily that students give me hope. I'm real glass half empty. But their hope gives me hope, right? And students have just almost like a relentless amount of optimism about the future. And that's something that I think we need now more than ever, especially, and that needs to be recognized, right? Especially in a moment where, if anything, it's kind of a smirking condescension is the way that kind of the public sphere tends to regard college students. And it's such a disconnect from the reality of campus and what students are like, and the energy that students have, the energy that students bring, and the energy that students have for the world. Would that the rest of us had that kind of energy, it would be a really different place. So I may be a hopeless cynic, but their hope gives me hope.
Thank you. Fox.
Mr. President, you give me hope.
Thank you.
You know, when I chaired the Commission on Race and Slavery, it created a little noise in the Davidson community, let's say. And it's interesting because I've lived 51 years, so apparently I can do one of these videos.
Sign you up right now.
Yeah, I'm getting signed up. I hope somebody's taping this because this could be my testimony. And throughout my entire life, I've had to kind of imagine myself in the role of people who didn't look like me. I remember 1977 going over to the Charlottetown Cinema and watching Star Wars for the first time and seeing Luke Skywalker and saying, man, that's me. And it's a difficult thing to live a life when other people can't do that in return. And we're in a process in our community, in our state, in our country, of sorting out. And what's sorting out is the realities of our history and kind of that coming back into our consciousness, coupled with sort of like we should keep things the way they are. And somewhere in all of that, there is a much better place for us as a society and for us as individuals. And I happen to think, getting back to you, Mr. President, not to put too much pressure, that you're leading at a time of this sorting out when there are infinite opportunities to create the right foundation for us to sort it out. And I think that is actually, my guess is that is going to be part of your legacy as president of this college. Now, there's proof that I have that this is going to work. And that is the day after the announcement that Doug Hicks would be our 19th president, I got a text message from my very best friend at Davidson. And his name was Joe Cook. Joe and I could not have been more different. I was from Charlotte, he was from Indianapolis. He was pretty conservative. I was pretty not conservative. Just about every way that we could be different, we were different. But we were brothers. And Joe wrote me, I did not know this through the process, but he said, inspired choice, Doug Hicks was a member of my church growing up. Davidson was not on my radar screen until I saw Doug Hicks go to Davidson. And it's because he went to Davidson that I came to Davidson. And so you see these shadows being cast in the life that you've led. And I'm very hopeful that somewhere in, again, the cacophony of where we are as a culture and society, your heart, your mind, your scholarship, your leadership is going to get us to a better place.
Thank you. This was not expected or scripted. If it had been, I definitely would have gone to you last. I'm truly grateful for that, and so energized and exhilarated and honored to be in this role, and I'm looking forward to this afternoon to make it official. I'm grateful to you all as panelists and the true expertise that you all bring, not just in what you shared today, but in the lives well lived that you are living. And your insights are great. I would love to continue this conversation, so we'll take a 5-minute, no. I want to say thank you. Please do get some lunch, enjoy the beautiful campus, and I'll look forward to seeing you all in the future, precisely at 2:30 p.m. in Belk Arena. Thank you very much.